My name is Faisal Kazi. I'm traveling from California, Southern California area. I'm in private practice neurology. I've had a long-standing interest in bioethics, and I'm involved in a number of endeavors in terms of the study of bioethics vis-a-vis Islamic tradition, including medical school programs and courses as such. Our next session involves two of our speakers. If they may come up, please, Dr. DeVries and Robert Vischer. Please come on up and take a seat. The overarching theme of really this session is a discussion of bioethics in the realm of newer developments such as technology and the role of culture and its place in both in the legal setting and really in a cultural setting as we delve into this. I'd like to introduce Dr. DeVries first as he would go. And we are limited to 20 minutes each, after which we would go into question and answer sessions. Dr. DeVries has his PhD, and he's a professor here at the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine at the Department of OB-GYN and Department of Medical Education here at University of Michigan. He's the author of A Pleasing Birth, Midwifery and Maternity Care in the Netherlands. And he's co-editor of The View from Here, Bioethics and the Social Sciences. He's at work on a critical social history of bioethics and is studying the regulation of science, international research ethics, difficulties of informed consent, bioethics, and the problem of suffering, as well as the social, ethical, and policy issues associated with non-medically indicated surgical birth. Dr. DeVries will be discussing really today something extremely fascinating, which is the trajectory of what seems to be developing as a uniquely Western bioethical field, yet it permeates and is processed in other cultures, and certainly your work is going to explore how it is indeed processed and how other cultures and societies have really implemented and indicated to work with it. As you know, in the overall arching human experience, in dealing with bioethical issues, there's always been conversations. Roman law, for example, in the 8th century, there was discussion and implementation in situations where, for example, if a pregnant woman dies, how a child should be immediately excised. In the Islamic tradition, prophetic model, we have traditions of the prophet that indicate that if a practitioner, a physician, ends up inadvertently any sort of harm to a patient, that particular physician must compensate the patient. So sort of the idea of malpractice. So the conversations have indeed been taking place. What Dr. DeVries here is going to explore is really the formalizing of this science in this unique Judeo-Christian Western paradigm along the lines of the development of the science of medicine itself. Please welcome.
Thanks, excuse me. Thanks for that introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this great day and a half together. And thank you all for coming, and thank Howard for that nice introduction, I think, which will get us on our way for talking about these things today. Here's the problem I want to talk to you about today. Basically, very simply put, when biomedicine travels, it brings bioethics along with it. And I'm really going to look at bioethics moving into new cultures. My challenge for you is to think about the opposite problem, which I think is a perfect parallel, which is people also move. And people move from one culture to another, and they move into cultures with different ideas about bioethics and morality and moral traditions. My focus is on this movement of bioethics from the West into other cultures, but I think it does parallel. So your challenge is to keep that in mind as I talk about this topic. I really see kind of a one-way influence with bioethics traveling across the world, essentially moving from North America and Europe to other parts of the world and bringing with it its own moral traditions and its ways of moral reasoning. Just to set you up, I want you to imagine something with me, and to take it out of the context of the United States, I want to move to another culture where I do some work, which is the Netherlands. Imagine that you're a Dutch bioethicist, and you've been invited to Nigeria to talk about a program for delivering dental care to those who don't really have dental care. The subjects in the study won't be exposed to any more than minimal risk of harm, which is the way our IRBs think about these things. But in fact, this is a research project that requires ethical oversight. And the question is, whose ethical standards should you use to have this oversight? In the Netherlands, there's a very well-organized system of research ethics review with a national center and local research ethics committees. And Nigeria actually has IRBs set up, and they have a federal-wide assurance, if some of you know what that is in research ethics, given by the National Institutes of Health. But you know as a researcher that often research is done without IR approval in Nigeria, and even when approval is given, the protocols are not often followed. So we could add more detail to this, but this is the bottom line I want us to think about. Here you are as this Dutch ethicist giving advice to Nigerians. Basically, what you're worried about is that the IRB, even in Nigeria, is going to be using a set of standards based on a completely different ethical tradition. And it's suited much more to a hypothesis-driven way of thinking about modern medical science, and it has nothing to do really with the values of the local population. Another way to ask this question is, can the Belmont Report, which is more or less the Bible of research ethics in the United States and elsewhere in the world, can it work in Nigeria? Can Nigerians use Western ethical ideas to protect human subjects? And there are people who say, sure they can, because the principles of the Belmont Report are universal. Respect for autonomy, beneficence, justice. These are those overlapping comprehensive ideologies that Howard was talking to us about. And there are equally many people, or maybe fewer, who say, maybe not. The principles, even if you modify them, don't really fit with local moral traditions. Let's just consider the Belmont Report in Nigeria and think about Nigerian autonomy or ideas of autonomy versus North American ideas of autonomy. In individualistic societies, we really believe that free and independent people should have the right to decide what's done to them. It's their choice and theirs alone. In communal societies, these decisions occur in consultation with others, and often with deference to the authority of a tribal leader. And so this contrast between, well, what's really autonomy stands out to you as an ethicist. Can you, in fact, as a European, speak of respect for autonomy if you know that in this research trial, decisions about participation will be made by someone else? So what's going on here? This is in looking at how bioethics moves across the globe. I've come up with a little typology. I think there's essentially three ways that bioethical ideas move. One is ideas are adopted wholesale. They're just, hey, you have the Belmont Report. We can make this work in Nigeria. We'll just start doing that here. A second way is, okay, you have these ideas, but what you do is you kind of mold them and shape them and kind of tweak them a little bit and make them fit. So the idea of autonomy, actually, if you think about it, could be applied by saying, well, in some societies, there's a different kind of autonomy. And that autonomy resides in the leader of the tribe or the clan or the village. And finally, and this is the one I want to get us to think about, you can use Western ethical ideas, but only to open a conversation about how you move from a moral tradition to ethical regulations. Let me talk first and in some detail about what I think is the most common way bioethical ideas move, which is wholesale adoption. And I've termed this bioethics as missionary work. This occurred to me when I was doing some work in Europe where students from the developing world were studying Western bioethics. And I noticed that there was really very little attention paid to their moral traditions. And there was really a lack of fit between what they were learning and what they would face when they went back to their home countries. And I think this idea of bioethics as missionary work is an apt comparison. There's a missionary, there's a bioethicist. And that both have really a noble intent. Their intentions are noble. The other commonality is that there's a one-way flow of influence. The missionary brings the gospel to this society and basically wants to inform this new society of all the value of the gospel, the good news. And I think there are dangers of unwitting harm that happen in both cases. Looking at that comparison in a little more detail, mission really means bringing the gospel, the good news. Could be the Bible, it could be the Belmont Report. And you find both in missionary work and in bioethics work this interesting similarity. As converts are made, a realization happens that this work shouldn't be done by somebody coming from outside the culture. It should be done by locals in the culture. And I think both in missionary work and in bioethics, we find the indigenization movement going on. And what is that? It means you bring people from local cultures to the West, as I saw in Europe when I was working over there. You train them in your ideas, and then you send them back. Because after all, they know the local culture. And this is done here in the US by the Fogarty Center. In Europe, it's done by the Erasmus Mundus program, which I was a part of, and the UK, the Wellcome Trust. All three of these programs really are indigenization movements for bioethics. And in case you think this is an old idea, Ruth Macklin, who's a fairly well-known bioethicist in the United States, said this at the International Association of Bioethics meetings last year. She's taking issue with this idea that bioethics is universal and doesn't apply to local society. She says, the claim that adherence to universal principles is ethical imperialism is misguided. The principles at the heart of so-called principalism are not peculiarly Western, although their origins may be in the Western philosophical tradition. So these are the problems I want us to focus on. There are different models of ethical reasoning, and when you try to bring the gospel, you have to face that, and different levels of relevance to the local situation. Just briefly, I have a lot more information on this, but I don't have time to share it all. I did some interviews with these bioethicists I was working with in Europe who were headed back to their home countries. And I talked to 21 of them. I asked them what they were learning and how this would apply when they got back to their own countries, and many other things, but I'll just focus on these. And some quick quotes from the interviews talking about, well, what is the source of ethics? This is one of the students. Ethics means Islamic culture, Islamic tradition. We don't differentiate between Islam and religion and ethics. And here's another student from China. If I want to accept all the theologies and the methods for the bioethics for Chinese people, it's a little difficult. We have different religions, and very few people believe in God. They're not Christian. So they have no sort of knowledge about Christian history, about Jesus. So you know, a lot of bioethics and methods and theories come from Jesus, by which he was saying from the Western Christian tradition. I asked them, where did you learn about bioethics? And here, our Wired World shows us something. Most people said, yeah, I basically look at English and American sources for bioethics. A lot of people go to the NIH. Countries in the developing world will use the NIH tutorials to teach research ethics to their people. As we've already heard a little bit, and I'm assuming some knowledge of the principles were developed in the United States, articulated first in the Belmont Report and later in Beecham and Childress's work. And they have these basic ideas: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And I think they're very seductive because I do think they can be universalized. And in spite of the fact, as Howard said, people are moving away from this, the actual practical ethical decisions on the ground often use principlism in a variety of cultures because principles are so sweet and easy to apply to problematic situations. And so we find they're very practical and very pragmatic. But do they fit with local culture? I just want to, from the interviews again, a few problems that I saw my students there identifying. Cultural problems. In Islam, justice is more important than autonomy. Islam said first your neighborhood, not first yourself. Someone else said, in rural India, the idea of autonomy is totally different. They don't even sign the admission sheet, not the patient or immediate person, the family signs, even for admission. And then she concluded, we're not thinking of autonomy of the person, we're thinking about the collective autonomy of the whole family. There are also structural problems with the principles. And here again, a student from India saying, look, if you just look at the way India is, it's not structured in a way to allow people to exercise their own autonomy. And here's somebody from South America saying, yes, bioethics is influenced by bioethics in the US, and we get taught the 4 principles, but it's not exactly like the US because we have a national health system, which I think he was tweaking me a little as an American. So the idea of having a principle of autonomy that can overrule other ones